Hello everyone, and welcome to the first lecture video of the first week of February. So this week we are going to talk about what is art. And we will dive deeper into this question. We talked about this question before, but we're going to take a closer look at it. Through this chapter, we will learn these points, explaining relationship between artists and their audience, discussing the relationship between art and beauty, categorizing art by its appearance, examining art for its meaning, and summarizing some purposes for art. So, through this chapter, obviously we are not going to reach to the definitive answer, like I said, and I don't think no one has a capacity to fully understand what art is and describe or express what it is through any kind of a human expression, whether it be written, oral, or through a work of art or an action. So, but through taking a closer look at some of the examples, we can kind of take a look at what assumptions that we make on this this fundamental question of what is art. So let's get going. So art is something that has great value in our many societies. So around the world, art museums are as much of a point of civic pride as new sports stadiums, pleasant shopping malls, public libraries, and well-maintained parks and things like that. So when you go to visit a new city, excuse me, visiting that city's artwork or art museum is one of like a must-to-do things, right? So art is, is something that we like to go see. So let's take a look at some of the examples. So has anyone been to Chicago before or from Chicago? Actually, when I first moved to United States, I moved to Chicago and lived there for a year. So my phone number is still, my area code is still Chicago number. But anyway, this is a public sculpture called Cloud Gate, better known as Bean because it looks like a bean, designed by English sculptor Anish Kapoor. Sir Anish Kapoor, by the way. He was knighted. Its mirror polished stainless steel form reflects and encapsulates the skyline of the city surrounding it and distorted to create another layer to this artwork. So that the form itself is not everything about it, but the reflection that it projects to its viewers is another layer of the art. So this work is located in Millennium Park in Chicago downtown, and it is one of the most popular tourist attractions of the city. As you can see me right there. It is a great spot for a selfie, by the way. I think that was summer of 2019. Excuse me. So like I said, when you go travel to a new city, visiting that city's art museum and public artwork is one of the must-do attractions these days. Not just these days, but has been. I used to visit New York City once a month because of my significant other. And every time I visited the city, I visited different museums and public sculptures and architectures. I am an artist after all, right? So it felt like I had to. I felt like it was my duty to visit these artworks. So back in 2019, I took 6 of ECU sculpture undergrad students to New York City trip for 4 days. The best part of this trip was that the trip was paid by the school, so I didn't have to spend a penny, by the way. Anyway. And we did a lot of museum visitings because, we were 7 of 7 artists. So that's only thing, not only thing, that was something that we had to do, of course. So this museum right here is a Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And this picture was taken back in 2019. So rest assured, it's still there despite the COVID. So when it gets better, the COVID gets better, and if you visit New York City, please make sure to visit this museum because it has amazing collection. And Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect of this building, has done a fantastic job creating this museum. So the way this museum is designed is that you climb up this spiral and you get this seamless and uninterrupted experience of viewing. Art viewing. So another cool structure, work of art, or architecture, I'm not sure what this is by the way, was this structure called the Vessel in New York City, located near the Hudson River, and it was constructed as a part of the, I think it was like a Hudson project or something like that. This is relatively new work. It was constructed back in 2019 or 18. And by the way, this thing its beauty is very subjective, but I thought it was somewhat cool and worth of visiting. So, but I wouldn't call it beautiful. I'll say. I don't know. What do you guys think? It is a structure that you can climb on. So people usually get in lines to climb this thing, but it was so cold that I think we visited like in early December after the final exams, I think. So it was very cold in New York City, and then Hudson River is right next to it, so you get that wind. So there was no one there in the line, luckily. I visited this structure multiple times, but I never got to climb it because of the lines. And I believe that we had to pay a small entrance fee to climb this monstrosity, but we did because there was no line, and it was a 6 tourists, visiting the city for the first time, so I feel like we had to. So there was some line for probably the slowest elevator that I've ever seen before. So we decided to walk up the stairs all the way to the top, and of course it was very cold. But anyway, it was a cool experience. So if you're in New York City next time, make sure to visit this thing. It's quite cool. So as you can see, a lot of money and effort is spent on exhibiting an artwork or a structure to express, some sort of a civic pride by the cities or the country or the neighborhood. This particular work unveiled to the public back in 2004, and it now serves as a most famous symbol of the city. So just to construct this thing, it costed $23 million and took them around 2 years to make it. If you count like the plannings and the competition and everything, it took more than 5 years just to execute this project. The prestige of art is such that many of us visit museums and go see public artworks because we feel like it's something that we should do, even if we are not exactly sure why. I mean, these days we go visit these things for Instagram, but still, there's a kind of a sense in us that I feel like we should, I don't know what it is, but I feel like we should visit, art museums and see some art. So this would be a great example of how society values art. So many artists from the past have left moving accounts of just how much they, artists themselves, too, valued art. So this fella right here, does anyone know who this is? Recognize his painting style? The Vincent van Gogh, the guy who painted the Starry Night, the famous painting that we all love. So for Van Gogh, to be an artist was a great and noble calling for himself, even if the price to be paid for it in life was high. As you can tell, this guy was a crazy guy, and he cut his ear off because of, I don't know what reason. In a letter written to keep up his brother's Theo's weakening spirits, Theo, his brother, was an art dealer, by the way, he admitted that the two of them were paying a hard price to be a link in the chain of artists, in health, in youth, in liberty, none of which we enjoy. And yet, he continued, there is an art of the future, and it is going to be so lovely and so young that even if we give up our youth for it, we must gain its serenity by it. So here, as elsewhere, he speaks of art in a way that makes it seem greater than any single painting or sculpture, So something that exists in an ideal realm of this particular artist, Vincent van Gogh. So, but what is art? This is not an easy question to answer, like I, keep mentioning. Let's take a look at some examples. So by far the most famous work of Western art From an Easterner's point of view, you don't have to say Western art. The most famous work of art, both Western and Eastern, would be the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci painted this painting during the early years of the 16th century, and the sitter pictured was a woman named Lisa del Giocondo, and Leonardo portrayed her seated on a balcony that overlooks a landscape of rock and water. Her left forearm rests on the arm of her chair. Her right hand settles gently over her left wrist. She turns her head to look at us with a hint of smile. So the portrait dazzled Leonardo's contemporaries, the guys who was hanging out with, due to its miraculous lifelikeness. The Mona Lisa's current fame, however, it is a product of our own modern era. So, just like how viral video becomes viral video, the hype and interesting facts or things that happen around it. The painting first went on view to the public in 1797 when it was placed in the newly created Louvre Museum in Paris. Writers and poets of the 19th century became mesmerized by what they looked to be the mystery and mockery of the sitter's smile. They describe her as a dangerous beauty, a fatal attraction, mysterious sphinx, a vampire, and any other fanciful things. So the public flocked to take a look. The portrait when painting was first introduced, of course it was famous and it was very popular, but it was not the most famous work of art like how it is today. It became so popular after it was stolen by this guy on the right here. So when the painting was stolen from the museum in 1911, people stood in line to see the empty space where it had been. So the theft itself was one of the biggest theft in a fine art world, something that you only see in movies and things like that. So that made this painting so popular and so famous. So after the theft, Louvre had to close down for a week for an investigation on the stolen work. A French poet, Apollinaire, came under suspicion and was arrested and imprisoned. Pablo Picasso was also under suspicion, however, they both found not guilty. The real pulp was an employee, Vincenzo Perugia, you see on the right here, who had helped construct the painting's glass case, by the way. So he entered the museum dressed as one of the employees and stole the painting when no one was around. He came into the museum not during night or early in the morning. He came in during the normal hours and just looked around. No one was around. He stole it and then came, walk outside. He was an Italian patriot. The motive behind it was that he was an Italian patriot who believed that the painting belonged to his country, Italy, not France. Leonardo da Vinci was Italian. He was working in Florence, which is Italian city. So that's the motive behind it. He hid it in his apartment for 2 years and then brought it back to his home country, arguably, Italy. He contacted an owner of art gallery thinking that he would be rewarded for returning the painting to what he regarded as his homeland. However, the owner informed the police and Perugia was soon arrested, ending to this whole, event of the greatest theft in the fine art world. So Mona Lisa was returned to the Louvre in 1913 after 2 years of being gone missing. When the painting was recovered 2 years later, its fame grew even bigger with the newspaper headlines and the large-scale police investigation. So all the drama around it, what made this painting so popular. Today, still safely sitting in the Louvre, the Mona Lisa attracts millions of visitors every year. People have to get in line and wait a very, very long time just to close look at the painting. I don't know what it is, but when I see a picture like this these days, it's like, oh my god, COVID. But back to the point, by the way. So those patient enough to make their way to the front and find their view, they view obscured by glare from the bulletproof glass box in which this priceless painting is encased. And if you take a close look at the painting, you see the layer of protective varnish covering the paint surface has crackled and yellowed with age, so it looks kind of ugly these days. So I mean, cleaning techniques exist, but who would take the risk with this irreplaceable work of art, right? Remember this work from the last lecture? So what about Marcel Duchamp's fountain? I mean, it is a type of artwork known as ready-made. This means that Duchamp did not make this urinal, but only designated it as a work of art. He made this designation by entering fountain into a New York art exhibition under a fake name, Art Mud, which he just slapped on in a black paint as a signature. Here we see a replica because Duchamp never intended for his ready-mades to be permanent, meaning that after the exhibition, the original went back to being its own original function, which is being a urinal, so to be peed on. I'm not sure it ever went back to wherever he found it, but anyway. So Duchamp's project was to find an object. He insisted that it be an object with no aesthetic interest whatsoever and exhibit it as art. After the exhibition, he hoped that his object was to be returned to life. Of course, fountain was pure, provocation. The exhibition organizer told him that all works of art submitted for the exhibition would be accepted, and Duchamp wanted to see whether they really meant it. Yet as Duchamp probably well knew, fountain also raised interesting philosophical question. Does art have to be made by an artist? I mean, in this case, this urinal, Marcel Duchamp did not make this personal urinal. He just found it and then designated to be an artwork. Or is art form of attention? Does art depends on context, on being shown in an art place such as museum and gallery? Or can something be art in one place and another? Is fountain still art today, or was it only art for the time that Duchamp said it was during the exhibition? So many answers have been proposed, but the fact that the philosophers still debate them should tell us that the questions are not easy. So we will never reach to any definitive answer. However, we will explore topics that touch on some common assumptions many of us have about art. Alright, so let's talk about the first topic, which is going to be artist and audience. So let's talk about this guy on the left, which is Marcel Duchamp, by the way. So Duchamp worked within his day's art world, which is similar to what we know today. So he attended an art school where he honed his skills and ideas. He works in a studio where he comes up with the concepts for his work and executes them, make them. And he exhibited his work in galleries and museums, designated locations for displaying art for public viewing. And art critics reviewed his shows, evaluating his work for its beauty, ideas, or concepts. And works are purchased by independent collectors and museums and so on. So this world of art schools, galleries, critics, collectors, and museums is still with us. We may think of it as the way things have always been, but not so much. So just a few hundred years ago, in 15th century, Italian artist Andrea del Verrocchio would have been a strange idea indeed. So one of the most talented artists of the early Renaissance, Verrocchio did not create what he wanted, but what his clients asked him for. He did not work alone, but ran a workshop staffed with assistants and apprentices. So practically a small business, essentially, that produced paintings, altarpieces, sculptures, banners, objects in precious metals, and architecture. He did not hope to have his art enshrined in museums, for there were no museums at all back then. Instead, displayed in public spaces, private residence, public civic buildings, churches, and things, places like that. So the products of his workshop became part of the fabric of daily life in Florence, the town where he lived and worked, and it was the center of the Italian Renaissance. Verrocchio had learned his skills, as all artists of the time did, by serving as an apprentice in the workshop of a master. So he did not attend like a art school or anything like that, because they did not have one of those back in those days. Boys began being apprentices between the ages of 7 and 15. In exchange for their labor, they received room and board, and sometimes a small salary. Menial tasks came first, together with drawing lessons, and gradually apprentices learned such essential skills as preparing surfaces for painting and casting statues in bronze. Eventually, they were allowed to collaborate with the master on important commissions. When business was slow, they might make copies of the master's work for sale over the counter. And Verrocchio trained many apprentices in his turn as well, including a gifted teenager named Leonardo da Vinci. So one of the Verrocchio's most famous work, this sculpture David, might have been a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. So this is one of Verrocchio's best known works, is a statue of the biblical hero David. The work was commissioned by Piero de' Medici, the head of a wealthy and powerful Florentine family, for display in the Medici family palace. The Piero's sons later sold it to the city of Florence, which had adopted the story of David and his victory over Goliath as an emblem of his own determination to stand up to larger powers. So thereafter, the statue was displayed in the city hall. So in this case, Verrocchio did not make this work to be shown in galleries or even for himself. He made it for a specific client for a very specific purpose. In his time, artworks were often created through patronage by government, the church, or wealthy families, such as Medici family, as you can see on the left. So the Medici family is so important name. The Medici name is so important, and you'll hear it time and time and again. Especially if you take like a Western civilization course. So let's take a look at who they were. The Medici family was an Italian banking family and political dynasty that had a huge impact on the 15th century Florence. They owned the largest bank in Europe during their time, and their family produced 4 popes of the Catholic Church and 2 queens of France. The Medici family have claimed to have funded the invention of piano and opera, and financed the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, which you see right here in Vatican City, and the Florence Cathedral, one of the most famous architecture of all time. So they were patrons of Brunelleschi, whom engineered this cathedral, and Botticelli. We looked this image before. Sandro Botticelli, who painted this painting, as we looked before. And Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, as you can see on the left. So does anyone know this painting? The title of it? So this particular painting by Michelangelo, painted on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel in Vatican City, was a commission work from Pope Clement VII, whose last name before becoming Pope was, you guessed it, Medici. And this work of art depicts the scene of the Last Judgment from the biblical story, painted in 1536 to 1541. Sandro Botticelli even included some of Medici family members' portraits into his painting. So as you can see in this example, the Adoration of Magi, it includes a couple of the portraits of Medici family members. So let's take a look at this video. See what I mean?
The origin of a work like the small Adoration of the Magi by Botticelli is certainly not one of the noblest, and not even the fruit of a pure love of art. The client Gaspare di Zanobi del Lama was an agent of the Arte del Cambio, the Bankers and Money Changers Guild. At that time, bankers and money changers were frowned upon by the church, that considered them comparable to usurers. Many of them, therefore, tried to save their souls by commissioning sacred works to donate to churches. This fact leads us to the origin of the Adoration of the Magi. This commission was also a public tribute to the Medici dynasty, since it illustrated a theme particularly dear to the family. Every year, on the day of the Epiphany, in fact, members of the family staged a historical reenactment of the Adoration of the Magi, parading through the city streets in the guise of the three kings of the Orient. In the painting, many members of the family and their court take part in the adoration. Cosimo the Elder plays the role of a wise man, kneeling at the child's feet, while the other two kings are seen in the portraits of his sons, Piero and Giovanni. A little more to the left, the character with the black and red mantle has the unmistakable profile of Lorenzo the Magnificent. On the other side, in the foreground, his brother Giuliano converses with the poet Agnolo Poliziano and the philosopher Pico della Mirandola. By virtue of his close relationship with the Medici, Botticelli was allowed to depict himself in the character on the far right looking towards the viewer.
Alright, so as you can see on the video, Botticelli included several members of a Medici family, and as you can see, this figure kneeling in front of Mary and baby Jesus is Cosimo de' Medici, who was the head of the family at the time, and his two sons, Piero de' Medici on the left and Giovanni de' Medici on the right. And if you take a look at the painting, there are only two figures that are staring straight into the viewer's eyes. So that'll be these two figures. So if you, on the left, Zanobi the Lama, who patroned this painting, looking straight into the viewer's eyes, letting them know who is responsible for this masterpiece and who paid for it. And the artist himself, Sandro Botticelli, on the bottom right, inserting himself confidently looking at the viewer. This is a work by an outside artist, James Hampton. We call him outside artist because he never had an art training, or we are not sure even he considered himself as an artist. This particular work, Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly, known as the Throne, so James Hampton was a janitor actually, working at DC, and he had no particular training in art. And the only audience he ever saw during his lifetime was himself, and this is only work that he ever created. So Hampton worked for most of his adult life as a janitor for the federal governments in Washington, D.C., but for many years he labored secretly on this extraordinary work, which is inspired by the second coming of Jesus Christ and the biblical book of Revelation. So this work, along with several notebooks, were discovered after his death in a garage that he had rented. So it is now exhibited in the famous Smithsonian Museum. We do not know whether Hampton considered himself as an artist, or whether he intended his work to be seen as art. He may have thought only about realizing a spiritual vision. So the people who opened Hampton's garage after his death might easily have discarded this as just a curiosity or like a hobby. Instead, they recognize it as a work of art, and today it is in museum collection and on view to the public. So let's take a look at this work, because this is really interesting work, because all you see right here is made by practically trash covered with aluminum and gold foils that you can find in households. So you see right here, that's a bulb actually, and a lot of them were cardboards and cans and things like that. So let's just take a look at this. You can tell that looks like aluminum foil just covering this object. Amazing craftsmanship though, right? Look at those bulbs. There's all bulbs right there. Another bulb. All these were made by found objects, usually the trash that he got from his work, because he was a janitor. And he did it all secretly. He never, talked about this to anyone else. And I don't think he ever intended this to be shown to the public. Otherwise, he would have definitely bragged about this, because the amount of time that he spent on this. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. Excuse me. So these days, in the modern times, we take it for granted that the artist's task is to pursue his or her own vision of art, to express his or her own ideas, insights, and feelings, and to create as a inner necessity dictates. We believe these things so strongly that we recognize people such as James Hampton as an artist and accept a broad range of creations as art. We assume that art is for anyone who takes an interest in it, and through museums, galleries, books, magazines, and academic courses, we make it available to a wide public. However, other times, such as Verrocchio's, do not share these ideas at all, and most visual creators across history have worked under very different assumptions about the nature of their task and the purpose it served and the audience it was for. That brings us to the next topic that we're going to be talking about is art and beauty. So when you think about what is art, the first thing that we might think of is aesthetic, simply beauty. Beauty is deeply linked to our thinking about art. Many of us assume that a work of art should be beautiful, and even that art's entire purpose is to be beautiful. But do you think is it true? I mean, we looked at the urinal, Marcel Duchamp's urinal, and the banana. I mean, those are not beautiful. I don't think so. Why are they art? So during the 18th century, when our category of art came into being, beauty and art were discussed together because both were felt to provide pleasure. Pleasure is an important word here. When philosophers asked themselves what the character of this pleasure was and how it was perceived, their answer was that it was an intellectual pleasure, and that we perceived it through a special kind of attention called disinterested contemplation. By disinterested, they meant that we set aside any personal, practical stake we might have in what we are looking at. So for example, if we are looking at a peach to see whether it is ripe enough to eat, we are contemplating it with a direct personal interest, to eat. But if we step back to admire its color, its texture, and its roundness, its form and proportion, with no thoughts of eating or no intention of eating, then we are contemplating it disinterestedly. Oh, that's a mouthful. If we take pleasure in what we see, we say the peach is just simply beautiful because of its formal aesthetic. So let's take a look at how beautiful it is on the left. The creases draping over to create these graceful arches, and the shadow and the light emphasizing the texture. One can say that this is a truly beautiful form. But can anyone tell me what it is? Without looking at the title. Now you looked at it just because I said it, but it's a cabbage leaf, as the title says. However, due to its beauty, we can almost feel our vision detaching itself from practical concern, such as cabbage leaf, good for coleslaw or salad. So if we detach that concern or detach that interest, we can appreciate this. We can appreciate this work of art as beautiful. But is pleasure what we always feel in looking at art? Francis Bacon, an English painter known for his raw and unsettling imagery. It's quite horrific images, right? Bacon's painting often depicts the human figure in scenes that suggest alienation, violence, and suffering, the wounded and traumatized humanity in post-World War II era. Bacon concentrated his energies on portraiture, often depicting scenes of the bars and clubs of London. So his subjects were always portrayed as violently distorted, almost looking like slabs of raw meat that are isolated souls imprisoned and tormented by existential dilemmas. Let's take a look at this video.
If you had to name the most influential movies of all time, Sergei Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin, made in 1925, is definitely among them. It reenacts a 1905 mutiny on a Russian battleship. Act 4 of the movie is one of the most shocking. The Odessa steppes will be the setting of a massacre where, very notably, a baby carriage rolls down the steps. But this video isn't about film history. The reason why I'm talking about this is because one of its stills was a major influence in the making of a 1953 painting, study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X.
Oops, I'm sorry.
But before talking about this painting, let's take a look at who made it. Francis Bacon was born in Ireland in 1909. His 1933 Crucifixion is his first work of art that will get public attention. Already, we can see Bacon's attraction for pain and fear. What is commonly said about Bacon is that his brushstrokes are violent, and you can already see this in Crucifixion. There's violence in the subject's neck and what appears to be ribs, but there's also a certain ghostliness with the figure, almost blending at times with the background. In 1944, 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion also gains notoriety, and again, the themes of fear and pain are exploited. These are monstrous figures, and they're all suffering. 5 years later, in 1949, Bacon creates a series of 6 heads. The first one has the same surreal feeling as the figures in the previous paintings, but there's a clear evolution in this series which results in the 6th head, which might seem familiar. It's one variation of Francis Bacon's popes. Study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X is, in fact, far from being the only time Bacon painted a pope. He created some 50 versions over 20 years. Head 6 and Study After Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X are the most popular renditions of Bacon's popes, and they're very similar. The difference is that, of course, Head 6 focuses on the Pope's head, while the Study After Velázquez's portrait shows the full body of the Pope. Head 6 also doesn't show the upper side of the Pope's face, while Study After Velázquez's portrait does, though it still retains a ghostly transparency. The paintings, as seen earlier, are influenced by Battleship Potemkin, but also, more importantly, by Velázquez's 1650 portrait of Pope Innocent X. Now, let's take a closer look at the painting. You see the Pope sitting on a golden throne, wearing white and purple. While in Velázquez's portrait the Pope looks comfortable and relaxed, Bacon paints him screaming and rigid. His hands seem to be tightly gripping the armrest of his throne as if he was suffering deeply. So far, the painting is pretty scary, but what really makes it horrifying and violent is, at least to me, the dark vertical lines covering the canvas. Those are thought to be curtains. Bacon often experienced with painting curtains, and the pattern observed here is very similar to what he did in the past. But here, the lines don't really look like curtains. If anything, they look like they're heavily falling on the Pope, painfully raining down on him and then crashing on the floor. The Pope's transparency makes it look as if the lines descending on him were, in a way, slowly burning him and making him disappear. These vertical lines are definitely a great example of Bacon's famous violent brushstrokes. They seem to be the reason for the Pope's suffering. Many have tried to interpret why Bacon decided to paint a screaming Pope. Perhaps it was because the Catholic Church brutally repressed his homosexuality, or maybe it was because of Bacon's staunch atheism. But the truth of the matter is that he only wanted to paint someone wearing purple, and not many figures wear purple aside from the Pope.
It's interesting that people want to read meanings into your pictures as if they were problem pictures or narrative pictures of some sort.
But one wants to read. People like to get a meaning from everything.
But they want to get a sort of story, don't they? Or to see the pictures as a kind of comment.
They do.
On
yes.
society.
They do.
Is it ever intended to be that?
No.
I mean, when you were in Rome, you went to see the Velázquez, the Innocent.
No, I didn't.
You never went?
No.
How long were you there?
I was in Rome for about 2 months.
And you never actually went to see this painting which you'd been working
I didn't.
after for years?
No. It's true to say that at that time I was extremely unhappy emotionally, and I loathed churches, but I spent most of my time in St. Peter's, just wandering around. But I think another thing was probably a fear of seeing the reality of the Velázquez after my tampering with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was probably a feeling of seeing this marvelous paint, at least what I'd always thought as a marvelous painting in photographs, and then seeing the stupid things that one had done with it.
By putting Study After Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X next to Portrait of Pope Innocent X, we don't only see the difference between the rendering of a similar subject, but also the incredible transformation art went through between 1650 and 1950. Velázquez's Pope is extremely realistic and is regarded by many as one of the best portraits ever created. It was made to reproduce, with great accuracy, reality. It was made so that Pope Innocent X could be remembered. Before the invention of photography, having your portrait painted was the only way to have future generations know what you look like. Bacon's Pope, on the other hand, is extremely different. Instead of being made to reproduce reality, it was made to share and express feelings, in this case, the intense pain and suffering boiling inside Bacon. Here, there's an immense difference between the reason why these painters made these portraits and how they did them. One painted to reproduce reality in order to immortalize someone, while the other painted to express deep feelings. And the interesting thing about this is that this difference doesn't have much to do with the artists themselves, but more with the social and historical context in which these artists lived. This is why art history is fascinating. Thank you for watching. We'd like to thank Isaac and...
Yes, that is why art history is fascinating. Right?
every other patron for supporting us.
Next slide. Alright, so let's take a look at other example. So a Spanish painter working during the decades around the turn of the 19th century, Francisco Goya, lived through horrific times and witnessed terrible acts of cruelty and stupidity and warfare and slaughter. So as an official painter to the Spanish court, he painted light-hearted scenes, beautiful landscapes, and dignified portraits as asked. In works he created for his own reasons, he expressed his increasingly pessimistic view of human nature. So on the left, Saturn devouring one of his children is one of a series of nightmarish images that Goya painted on the walls of his own house. By their compelling visual power and urgent message, we recognize them as extraordinary art. But we must admit that they leave notion of pleasure and beauty far behind. And on the right, the example that we looked, the 3rd of May, which was to commemorate the Spanish resistance to Napoleon's army. But Goya captured the horror of the war so vividly that, and it becomes somewhat gruesome. Art can indeed produce pleasure, as the first philosophers of aesthetics noted, but it can also inspire sadness, horror, pity, awe, and a full range of other emotions as well. And beauty remains a mysterious concept. It's very subjective. Something that everyone senses, many disagree about, and no one has yet defined. Artists are as fascinated by beauty as any of us, and return it to again and again and again. Though not always in the forms we expect, often they seek out beauty in new places, such as the example that we see on the the cabbage leaf. So that is art and beauty. Alright, so for the next lecture we are going to be talking about the rest of the chapter, so make sure to read the chapters, which is going to be chapter 2, what is art, and most of the questions for the exams are going to be coming from the lectures and textbooks, so it'll be very helpful for you to read the chapters each week. Alright, I'll see you guys on the next lecture on Wednesday night.